Hi. Our show today is about roommates. And when McCusker the Whiz Kid, who was producing it, when she first brought it up the first time at a meeting, I said, well, we really would have to have Ken Jennings on. And then people thought I was talking about the host of Jeopardy. And then I had to explain, no, we have to have my college roommate on. Ken Jennings and I roomed together for 3 years. And so, Ken, I think we should try to remember a little bit about that first day. I should set the scene a little bit. You were a young black man from Landover, Maryland. You were playing freshman football. You would go on to play Yale football for all of your time there, and you were a big star in your senior year. And I was this kind of fake hippie or something. But I don't know. What do you remember about that first day?
Yeah, what I remember is I showed up at our plays, and what they told me was I was going to have two football players for roommates. And then I see this guy, this tallish, gangly man approaching me with his hand stuck out. Hi, I'm Colin McEnroe. I'm your roommate. And the first thought bubble I had was, he's not a football player, is he? And so we just had that first handshake, and then the next breath, you said, "I found a sofa downstairs. Let's go get it." And so we went down into the basement of Farnham Hall, which is remarkably old and dusty place, and found this green sofa that was like the pig pen of sofas. Every time you sat in it, a cloud of dust would
It's so true.
Jump out of it.
It was maybe the most disgusting piece of furniture I've ever seen in my life. But I think about another thing. So I think it's fair to say that when you arrived on campus, you had been raised very carefully, and you were kind of a socially conservative person in the sense that our other roommate, Gary Railanu, used to say, you don't drink and you don't smoke, and what do you do? And then he would put something kind of unpleasant at the end of that question. But and I was maybe coming from a slightly different environment. And I'd say our second or third night, I hope it wasn't our first night, I went out with a bunch of people that I knew from home, including a guy named Eric Tulin, who, like Lord Byron, was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And Eric kind of introduced me to the whole tequila, lime, salt ritual in a way that I had never experienced it before. And I came back to our room very, very drunk and opened the window onto College Street and emptied the contents of my stomach into the ivy down below the window. And I remember you saying later that this particular moment was a little jarring for you.
Yeah, I do remember. I said, why is he opening his window? And then when he started, you started your speech to the ivy below. I said, well, what have I got myself into? I got one guy sitting on me in the living room because I won't skip class. And I got the other guy going out and drinking too much tequila. So I just said, okay, well, it's a good thing I have a door on my room. And that's what I remember. But at the same time, I'd been around alcohol. I just hadn't been using it myself. And you all helped me with that.
No, you remained fairly upstanding in that regard. You loosened up a little bit, but you had a cleaner life than most of us, I think, because you were taking care of your body, because you were an athlete. One thing that I was thinking about was that we were very different on the surface, but I think there were some ways below the surface that we were very similar. And what I would say is that despite the fact that you were a jock, you were kind of a nerd, and I was kind of a nerd. We both loved comic books. We liked science fiction television shows, and shows like the old Avengers, not the Marvel Avengers, but the one with Diana Rigg as Emma Peel. And there were a lot of kind of nerdy things that once we got past the surface differences, you and I both had a big interest in.
Our friendship was just easy.
Mm-hmm.
It was effortless. And I think that's why it has endured all this time.
Oh, we have to do this one thing, which is, and this is totally going to make me look horrible, but when I showed up there, I had this little it was sort of a little stereo, and I had a bunch of albums with me. And, you obviously grown up with a very different kind of music. And you should tell the audience what I subjected you to in like what I thought was really great music in 1972.
I'd never heard of Seals and Croft. And the song Hummingbird still rings in my head, and then sometimes I find myself whistling it. And I said that Colin, because you played the stew out of that.
Yeah, I'm so
and
sorry.
I can't remember what I was playing. I think I was playing mandrel.
Yes. And I just want to say, you were right. I was wrong. I didn't see it at the time, but I was listening to some fairly lame music, and you weren't. All right, Ken Jennings, so great to hear your voice. Well, I mean, I just want to keep hearing your voice. We started out in 1972, and we're still going, so that's good, right?
Absolutely. So thanks so much for this time to reminisce. Best of luck, and we'll be talking real soon.
Somehow keep getting longer, and those scared voices.
I'm curling into a fetal position listening to that music. But it's also, it says something about that relationship. Dylan Reyes, who we recorded that interview last week, and Dylan Reyes afterwards said that he hadn't heard me laugh that much ever, and in one spell, and just noted the degree to which I kind of lit up. And I think that's true. It's one of those relationships that, there's sort of nothing like it. So yeah, we're going to talk about roommates on the show today. I was saying before the news that really the history of sitcoms is the history of roommate shows, whether it's The Odd Couple or The Golden Girls or The Big Bang Theory or Friends or Laverne and Shirley or Mork and Mindy. These are all Three's Company. These are all shows predicated on the idea of roommates. But to me, the other thing I thought about when McCusker the Wonder Kid first proposed this show was the animated superhero series, The Tick. And in one episode of The Tick, the villain is this kind of horrible looking purple and green interdimensional monster named Thackerzog or something. And he has a roommate. He's like a big, huge monster who lives in an apartment in the city. And just to make ends meet, because he's apparently not a trust fund monster, he has just a regular human roommate. And on one occasion, he has captured the Tick's sidekick, the Moth, and has him tied to a board and leaves him alone. And the roommate comes in and kind of accidentally lets the Moth get away. And here's how things go down after that. Maestro, C3.
Hey, what's happening here?
A little bunny guy was chafing himself on the ropes, so I loosened him up a bit.
You what? He's a moth guy, and how many times do I have to say it? Don't touch my stuff. This is my side of the living room, and that is your side of the living room. And must you drink straight out of the milk carton? It's disgusting.
So even monsters have their limits. And I think that's sort of a lot of people's default idea of a roommate relationship. Doesn't have to be that way. We're having roommates more and more, as you're about to hear. And in those instances, we have to learn how to live and not drink out of the milk carton and not let superhero sidekicks get away just because we don't know any better. And here to tell us more about all that is Kelli María Korducki, a journalist who writes about work and the family, wrote a remarkable article a few years ago called The Rise of the Roommate for the publication The Walrus. Kelli, welcome to our show.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, part of the central thrust of your article is that, in all likelihood, millennials and Zoomers are probably going to stay in that roommate phase longer than some of the generational cohorts that preceded them, right? There are various forces at work that make maybe the roommate arrangement more attractive or more necessary. Could you say some more about that?
Absolutely. So yes, you're totally correct that it seems as though this trend is not going to be going away anytime soon. And there are a few different reasons for that. The main one is cost. Cost of living increases, real wage stagnation, increasing job insecurity, tech developments kind of changing the nature of the way that we work really, really fast and completely transforming various industries in super dramatic fashion. So all of this combined has, it's forced young adults and not so young adults to kind of be a little bit more creative about their living arrangements.
Yes, I was doing some research for the show too. I even found some new things. Like I think there's one called Nesterly, which kind of specializes pairing up maybe a childless older person or couple with people seeking kind of a roommate situation, but not the kind of generational peer kind of relationship. But that's a fascinating idea as well, and probably a sitcom premise as well. But you bring it. One of the sort of cruxes of your article is kind of a fork in the road you found yourself at near the start of the pandemic. You had a roommate. You also had a partner with whom you did not share living quarters. And as the pandemic began to fold around us and impose lockdowns on us, you had some complicated choices to make, all of them kind of involving where you were going to live. So tell people that story.
That's right. Yes. So flashback to early 2020. I lived with a roommate who was more susceptible to complications from COVID-19 than the average member of the population. So she was very, very, very COVID cautious, and my partner lived maybe like a 10-15 minute walk away. I had cats. I still have cats, and he was severely allergic, so we did not live together mostly for that reason. So anyway, lockdown approaches, and we had to make a decision. I had to either leave the cats and move in with my partner and basically leave all my stuff. At that time, it was not totally clear how the virus was transmitted. So the agreement was pretty much like, if you leave, if I were to leave and go with my partner, I couldn't come back to like pick up some of my stuff or say hi to the cats or whatever. Like I had to stay away. This was no pandemic pod situation. So I ultimately chose to stay home and stay with my roommate and my stuff and my cats. And it was, I'm not going to pretend that it was an ideal situation or an easy situation. But it was, I think, a really, really important experience to have had. My roommate and I were both women in our, at the time, mid-30s. And we had never really been forced to spend tons and tons of time together and negotiate these really, really close boundaries during a time of crisis and a lot of fear. And it was a really instructive life experience, just in terms of negotiating boundaries and communicating and sharing really, really intimate space, 600 square foot apartment, with somebody who isn't a romantic partner or a relative.
Yeah, there's something very interesting about that trajectory too. And I think maybe it's very specific to the present moment, maybe to your generation and the one that's trailing behind you. Because I think people's default assumption is, okay, so there's my family, and maybe there's the family I'm hoping to start, maybe with a partner or something like that. And then my roommate, the roommate is kind of a transitional figure. It's an arrangement of convenience. It's maybe somebody that I wouldn't be surprised if I wasn't in touch with 7 years from now. This is maybe just a thing that we're doing at this moment. But you actually kind of prioritized that relationship. And there were a lot of reasons to do it, including the cats and your partner's severe allergy to cats. And I mean, there were reasons to do it. But those reasons also included prioritizing her health situation, her disposition towards a greater risk from COVID. So I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that choice. It maybe isn't the choice somebody in your shoes would have made, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. And it was a choice that was a bit baffling to some people. But, here's the thing, like we we are all members of a society. We are all, whether or not we think about it, we're all in community with others. And it's actually, I think, really, really healthy and good to have that reality foregrounded in our day-to-day lives, because it often isn't. We're actually, often quite atomized in the existence that we live today. Part of that is just due to the nature of work, the 9 to 5, or the whatever to whatever. We're not really hanging out with large groups of people in a casual setting necessarily that often. And also, many of us do live in nuclear families where we're really spending most of our interpersonal time with somebody that we've married or that we are parenting or what have you. So kind of breaking out of that really siloed way of living, it's an opportunity, I think, to plug into the wider world in a small and maybe counterintuitive way.
Yeah, and I wonder also if the nature of the roommate relationship means that you can, in a way that might be more difficult in a different kind of relationship, kind of make a Mayflower compact, about how you're going to live. In other words, if you pair up with somebody as a partner, you start a family, whatever, you can try to make some rules with each other and some agreements with each other, but they're hard to maintain because what's really happening there is your marriage or your partner status or whatever kind of family you're trying to bring up, and it's kind of day to day. Whereas with somebody who's a roommate, and correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, maybe there's a little bit more of an opportunity to say, okay, so we're both here for whatever the duration is, and let's make some rules we can live by and see how that goes. I don't know. Do you think it's maybe a little bit easier to negotiate that with somebody who's quote unquote just a roommate?
That's funny you should ask that. I think it's easier and maybe more fraught. I think for some people that kind of negotiation doesn't necessarily come naturally, because it's sort of like almost conflict adjacent, even though it's not actually. It's a conflict prevention mechanism actually, but discussing ground rules, I think, is really scary for a lot of people, and I happen to be one of those people for whom it is really scary. If it were up to me, I would just quietly go with the flow, and then if something annoys me, I'd suck it up until I couldn't anymore and then lose my temper. That's my way of doing things, which I don't recommend. But I've been really lucky to have had roommates in the past who were so much better about this stuff than I was, who were really, really good at just, yelling at me when I left dishes in the sink, which honestly is an experience that everybody should have. You should be yelled at when you leave your dishes in the sink, which is, inconsiderate to the people you live with. And yeah, the pandemic example is also a pretty clear one. My roommate at the time had really, really clear boundaries that she was comfortable with. And her health was at stake. And so I kind of had no choice but to respect them. And I was fine with that. I appreciated that she was clear and didn't leave it up to me to guess and then misstep. It was like I said earlier, it really was a very instructive experience, and I think one that I'll carry forward with me for the rest of my life.
Right. Another point you make in the piece, and I think it's a good one, is that sometimes in our primary relationships, we kind of default into what our understanding of that is. So I'm the man, so I do this. You're the woman, so you do that. Or however that winds up getting divided up. I'm being super binary right now, but there's sort of like, oh, well, I'm the man, so I don't do the dishes or something like that. Whereas with a roommate, once again, you are basically building a society from scratch. So you have maybe a little bit more opportunity to explore what equality actually means. Also, reading your piece, I was struck by, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. So when you're in college, you wind up living in what initially seems like a rather enchanting situation of this kind of dilapidated mansion that holds 11 or 12 people. And I started reading it, and at first I thought, well, that sounds really fun. This is kind of cool. And then, some of the darker stuff comes out. But that's clearly a situation that might be charming when you're 20, but not charming even 4 years later, right?
Yeah. So that experience was charming and super formative, and I'm still really, really close to a number of the people that I met and lived with at that time. And yeah, super charming. You're thrown into this house with a bunch of people. It's also just kind of an automatic built-in community, which is a nice thing to have at any age, but it's particularly nice to have with people who are, a mixed group. Like, we were not all the same. We came from different backgrounds, different countries. We're studying different things. And so it was kind of like a real motley crew in the best possible way. But the flip side is that when you do have a more transient co-housing situation, you don't always get to be super selective about who you share your space with. And so the kind of revolving door experience of, saying goodbye to people and then saying hello to, who knows who, at the start of the next school year, that became exhausting. That became exhausting for me. And I think it became exhausting for a lot of my friends too. And I the large cooperative house situation is a bit unique, but there is a degree to which that's also true of any roommate situation. You're not legally bound to each other. You may opt to live with each other for a long time, but there's nothing really holding you in place. And so the roommate status can end up becoming sort of an open revolving door situation too, and not necessarily a long-term project between people who have come to know each other.
All right. So last question, and that is, since the end of World War II in here in North America, there's been this kind of notion that success and advancement involves kind of having more space for yourself. So you move out of your house. Maybe you have to have roommates, but maybe pretty soon you get your own apartment. I got my own apartment, and then I get married and we get our starter home, and then we get another home with a bigger lot, so that we're not as close to our neighbors and all of that. And one of the things that we've realized over time, and social theorists started picking up pretty early in the process, is that's also a recipe for loneliness. And there are an awful lot of people who would immediately choose to have their own apartment rather than to have a roommate. And as we close, I think you have a slightly different perception of that, maybe especially after what you went through in the pandemic. But, in terms of loneliness, maybe roommates are kind of a good idea sometimes.
Yeah, I think roommates are a great idea in terms of staving off loneliness. A roommate sort of opens your world, especially if there's somebody who you weren't necessarily like buds with before. Like your story about with your college roommate is a great example. You're kind of thrown into this into this space with somebody who might come from a pretty different background and have a different experience and different friends, and they become an access point to a broader slice of experience and the world. And that's a great antidote for loneliness.
Absolutely. Kelli María Korducki, thank you so much. Journalist who writes about work and the family. I would definitely seek out Kelli's article about this in The Walrus, The Rise of the Roommate. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back, tell you a little bit more about statistically what goes on when people share living quarters.
Living together, growing together, just being together, that's how
hold me too close, someone to hurt me too deep, someone to sit in my chair and ruin my sleep and make me aware of being alive, being alive.
All right, so you've heard a little bit of the story, and believe me, it's only a little bit of the story, of two college roommates, me and Ken Jennings. Now joining us is somebody who's looked at this across a much broader statistical spectrum. Bruce Sacerdote is a professor of economics at Dartmouth College, has been involved in a lot of research into roommates. So first of all, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
In a way, the whole college roommate system, particularly the whole college roommate system to the extent that it is randomly assigned, or at least not, in freshman year modifiable by the roommates. It's like a big social psychology experiment in a way. I mean, you really do have an opportunity to see how people deal in a situation where they're suddenly sharing living quarters with somebody they've never met before. So, I mean, I guess in a general way, maybe you could say a little something about that. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities for investigation here.
I agree. You're absolutely right. And this is you're describing the early part of my career. There was a trend in economics which started when I was in graduate school and has continued up to present day, which is to try to isolate cases of natural variation where you can really answer questions with some confidence and some knowledge that these are really causal things we're looking at and not just correlation. And so when I first got to Dartmouth on the faculty, it occurred to me that this randomization of people into rooms was a super interesting social experiment, as you just said. So myself and co-authors and colleagues have looked at all manner of outcomes and all manner of questions using this technology.
I mean, one of the obvious questions is who demonstrates gravitational pull on whom? Obviously roommates affect one another. And you've looked at things as basic and as intrinsic to the college experience as GPA, as academic performance. And even there, in a place like that, you do see some kind of effect of roommates upon one another. What have you found there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's all different ways to measure how much roommates affect each other's study time and GPA. But the simplest way to put it is that suppose you have rooming groups of two, if my freshman roommate has let's say incoming scores that are a standard deviation higher, that tends to pull my GPA up by like 0.07. So, a pretty meaningful amount.
Yeah, that is a pretty meaningful amount. So my roommate and I, we met in 1972, graduated in 1976, roomed together for 3 years. We're, I think, going to turn out to be statistical outliers, but he is black, I am white. We grew up in fairly different circumstances. He was also a Yale football player. I was not a Yale football player. But I mean, the race thing is interesting too, because no matter what we think or say or want America to be, in a lot of ways, we're still kind of socially segregated from one another an awful lot, and so I'm wondering about all that, because this is a situation where, before it gets sorted out in some other way, you can have white students and black students and other racial kind of combinations together unexpectedly. What do you see in all that? What kinds of results do you get?
Yeah, well, you really set this up perfectly. Because that's exactly what we find. Your experience is quite similar to what we find. I mean, maybe your bond with Ken may be stronger, a bit stronger than average or stronger than average, but what you've experienced is exactly what the data suggest. There is a lot of if two people are not roommates, there's a lot of racial homophily where Black and white students are far less likely to interact. But in theory, you could wipe out all of that gap if you were able to put two people in the same freshman dorm. And if you put them in the same room, even more so. So, of course, not everyone could be a roommate with everyone else, but it does completely undo that tendency towards racial homophily. In our data, just being in the same dorm would multiply the chances of two people interacting by like 4, and putting them in the same room, then you're multiplying by like a factor of 10. And about 30% of freshman year roommates will go on to be in the same room or same dorm sophomore year. And so a lot of that sticks with you. And we found that both at Dartmouth and at the Air Force Academy. We found, very similar results with randomly assigned squadrons.
As I understand it, people who are paired with a roommate of a different race are more likely to go on to maybe live with someone of a different race in later years and maybe other situations.
Well, that's certainly what other researchers have found. And we do see that in the Air Force Academy data. I can't prove that in the Dartmouth data. I find that there's a huge boost in same race interactions, but that mostly is with your roommate or dorm mate herself. And it's not, unfortunately, in the Dartmouth data, I wasn't finding that it entered you in, that you would be then kind of entered into this network of non-white or black peers. That it mostly stuck with the there wasn't this networking effect that I thought we might see. But with regard to other studies, there's one at a big Midwestern private, and they find exactly what you say. Attitudes change, attitudes about affirmative action and about the importance of government intervention, things. Those are changed by with whom we live, and also, if you've got more black folks in your squadron at the Air Force Academy, we see a boost in the likelihood that you choose a black roommate.
One of the other things you've been able to study, Bruce, is how this affects the rest of your life. Whether it's, say, an interracial rooming arrangement, freshman, sophomore year in college, or any other kinds of mixing that goes on as a result of being assigned a roommate. What have you learned about sort of how that affects choices going forward in life?
Yeah, so great question, because honestly, like, the GPA effects are meaningful, but I think there's much bigger effects on what social groups you're in, like, whether or not you join a Greek system, whether or not you join a Greek house. That's would be in the Dartmouth data. I find that there's really big effects on of your dorm on major choice and on career choice. And so, if you think about, maybe, let's say at some of these elite schools, maybe 30% of people go into finance. Well, if you were living in a dorm filled with finance people, that would like boost your chances by 50%, maybe from 30% to 45% or something. There's very large effects because people, you bump into people in that dorm, and maybe maybe they or their parents have some interest in finance, and that tends to drag you in that direction. And the reverse is true also. People are pulled towards law school or towards graduate school, or all manner of things.
Yeah. So I'm also wondering, it does seem as though one of the things that happens freshman year is you meet your roommates, you meet a bunch of people in your dorm or your entryway or whatever, and you're arriving with your own personal history and probably family influences that have formed you. And so you might have certain attitudes about, for example, drinking or something like that. And people arrive. I mean, in the case of me and Ken really had not. I mean, he was a football player. He was very serious about taking care of himself. I think he had pretty strict parents as well. I don't think he'd ever really done any drinking or anything like that. This is an area where you're going to right away encounter a whole bunch of people whose experiences coming in are different, whether it's about drinking or some other aspect of college social life. What have you learned about that?
Yeah, well, there are tremendous, and this is both a combination of what I see in Dartmouth data and also what people see at other universities, where the social impacts are, I would say, larger than the GPA impacts. I mean, of course, one study habits do tend to rub off, but social impacts can be much more immediate. So the number of times that people sort of go out socializing, or number of times they drink alcohol per week can be really boosted by your roommate, and you can tell that it's really stemming from the roommate and not from something about the dorm, because we have these survey data about how much they drank beer or used beer or wine in high school. And so, even before they arrive, what their affinity might be to go out and drink. And it clearly rubs off on their roommate. This is in some ways, helps people get socially integrated and spend time with the rest of the campus. So it's not I don't say that this is a bad thing. This could be potentially a very good thing in many cases.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. And first of all, thank you so much, Bruce Sacerdote, Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College, for your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, we're going to take a little break. We're going to tell you more about roommates after this. So our technical producer today is the maestro, Dylan Reyes. Thanks to him, the episode today is produced by McCusker, the Wonder Kid, and her bad cat, Penelope. Penelope, you're a bad roommate. But we are going to talk a little bit more about roommates here. And now, in studio with me, A Star is Born. Francesca Fontanez is here. She'll be CT Public's lead social media editor starting in June. But her claim to fame today is having been an RA. And in college. First of all, tell us where you went to college. And for people who don't know that term, I think most people do, explain what an RA is.
Thank you so much for having me. I was an RA over at the University of New Haven for 3 years. And so RA is short for residential assistant. And so for the 3 years that I'm employed and contracted, my life revolves around residential life, making sure that everyone has a community, everyone is safe, and everyone is uplifted to the best of our ability.
And I was asking you this during the break, but what percentage of the work that you have to do with people who are having problems involve roommate problems?
In regard to negative conversations, when I really think back to any kind of issues or situations that arose, I would say about 50% of them had to do with housing, roommate-based issues.
And it's sort of things like, well, people bringing members of the opposite sex or same sex or whatever back to the room, and I mean stuff like that, or just habits or everything.
It was definitely a combo. We had some heavy hitters, cleanliness differences. This is both personal hygiene and kind of style, frequency of cleaning within the living space. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time as well, we did have some severe cultural difference issues. We had a lot of international students, and this was one of our reoccurring kind of cultural insensitivities. And how do we navigate these things? You have to consider how some people were raised in Long Island and some people were coming from across the sea. So there are naturally going to be quite a few differences, and they weren't always, learning experiences happy for everyone. We kind of had to work through that.
So let's do a cleanliness example here, and you can talk about how you would handle this as the RA. This is from one of our listeners via email. This is from Rose. This is C1 Maestro.
In college, we were all slobs, except for this one poor neat freak, John. I don't know why he chose to room with us. And at first, it was just accidental that we would offend him by using his dishes or eating some of his cheese. But his reactions were so dramatic that we ended up kind of purposely using his stuff just to get a rise out of him. In response, he started hiding dishes, pots, food in his bed under the top blanket to try to prevent this kind of encroachment. But it continued until the final showdown, when one of my roommates took an unopened box of grocery store donuts out of John's bed, made a tiny hole in the corner of the box, and then used a needle to coax out a single donut, crumb by crumb, through that tiny hole. The box looked untouched, still brand new, unopened. When John got home, he went to his room, opened his box of donuts, and started yelling, "Who ate my donut? Where's the 6th donut?" We all expressed astonishment and denied any involvement. And in the morning, he was on the phone to the manufacturer complaining, and we were all laughing. In the years since, I have felt bad about it. I don't know why we tormented him like that. But it also still does make me laugh.
I just want to say that Francesca has a very expressive face, and watching her expressive face during the playing of that recording was very interesting. So this sounds like an off-campus living situation, probably. But you can probably relate to some of this anyway. I don't know, as an RA, first of all, I assume you would have tried to put the pin in this grenade a little bit sooner than when the donut incident came.
This is so fascinating. We actually had some housing that was technically under our umbrella, but it was off-campus housing. So we did have these sort of shenanigans, and we referred to this sort of mischief as shenanigans. And when this kind of situation arises, usually what our first move is to figure out how much is this impacting John in this scenario? Because, of course, you know, people are pulling pranks, people are having fun. But at this point, I would be very curious to know if John thought this was as whimsical as it sounds, you know, being read back a couple years later, or if this was seriously encroaching on his way of life. So if, you know, this came to our attention by way of John, that would be one thing, as opposed to another roommate who would say, you know, I'm kind of concerned. Like, it started out kind of fun and lighthearted, but it's been a couple of months. John's calling the manufacturer. So I think the first step in my case would be checking on the level of severity.
The other thing, a couple of things strike me listening to this story, and it's the difference between our lives now and our lives then. One of them is the sheer amount of time people have on their hands when they're in college. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't have time to remove donuts crumb by crumb through a secret tiny hole in a donut box. I'm too busy to do that. But if I did have a lot of time in my hands, as I did in college, I mean, that's what people do, right? They think up stuff, for want of a better word that I could say on the radio, stuff to do to mess with other people's heads.
We actually had a rumor on our campus, and all the kids, you know, in our building, they were super quiet and they didn't want to tell us. And we're like, what is happening? You're starting to make us nervous. And they said, well, some of the ROTC kids, they took down one of the walls and they put in a prop skeleton because it was Halloween, and they patched it up. And I said, what room? We ended up finding out, and I looked at the room and I looked at the wall, and the alleged patchwork was so good. I was like, I don't know if this is true or not. But we're so impressed. We're like, you know what? We'll let it slide.
Yeah. I think the other thing from that story, too, is we have too much time on our hands in college, and our super egos are not fully developed. So we will do things like this.
Oh, right.
Just to see what people do, as opposed to thinking, I wonder if, like, your point is a really good one. What does John really feel about this? They don't care.
It must be so nice to have that kind of time and the commitment.
Right.
I also think the level of effort, like the commitment that these kids were like, you know, piece by piece with this donut, that's really dedication to the craft.
It
truly.
is. It is. You have to sort of tip your hat in a weird way. Tess Terrible, a producer from where we live, lived in an apartment with 3 musical theater majors in college. They sang a lot. Actually, that doesn't sound so bad, depending on what they were singing and how good they were. But noise level has got to be just sort of, noise is just an issue for roommates, right?
Absolutely. I think probably as long as people have lived together, noise has been an issue. Work schedules have been an issue as well. I think that for those sort of situations, it's definitely just like a ground rule, laying them out as soon as you can, as, you know, concisely what you need from the other person, so that there's no confusion. Oh, we're not allowed to sing Les Mis at 12:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night? Nope, that's not part of our agreement. So I would recommend, you know, sooner rather than later, just telling people your boundaries, and that should avoid many conflicts.
Yeah, you shouldn't sing Les Mis at any time of day. But, okay, so here's a more serious one. This is from Margot Lynn. A roommate who joined a Bible study group that veered into such rigid interpretations that non-Christians felt threatened by, quote, power prayers outside their doors. She scratched the eyes out of all the photos of her high school friends and carved crosses onto their foreheads in the photos because they had not been saved enough, even though they went to the same Baptist church that she did and had been in her Bible study groups. Made list of everybody in our dorm who needed to be saved and burned the list as a symbolic cleansing. It goes on and on. But that's a little more red flaggy. Like, you know, maybe that doesn't even stay at the RA level. Maybe, I don't know who you go talk to when stuff like that is happening.
So we've actually had a couple of incidences. This kind of falls under, like, I don't really know how to describe it. It's kind of touchy, but like, intimidation, or basically there have been scenarios and situations at my university where people's beliefs were encroaching on other people's lifestyles. And so we actually have, I think it's just like a student life office. It's like an umbrella that we all fall under, like res life, student life, operations in that manner. How, there are certain things that are allowed to be put up like in the dorm. You can't just go up and put like you're going to burn statue. You can't put things up. You have to get everything approved. You cannot touch anyone else's property. Like these are actually all documented, a very long rule book of things you can and cannot do. So a lot of the time it seems like the easy answer, but you can just, at least in my case, we could say, oh, we're really happy that you found something that you belong to and something that makes sense to you. But not everyone feels that way. And you are not allowed to encroach on other people's lifestyles. And so we would point it out in the handbook. And for the most part, people understood, and they would keep the saving to a minimum while they were on campus, at least.
So how was your own roommate situation in college? Do you have nice roommates?
I did have I had lovely roommates. I only had roommates my freshman year, actually. And I was really blessed to actually get a third roommate because my roommate had a boyfriend. They were high school sweethearts. They're married, beautiful couple to this day, two of my closest friends, because her boyfriend spent so much time with us because his roommate was horrible. So hopefully they don't listen to the radio station, but one of the two roommates, I ended up, at first we're like, why is this random guy in our room? But he eventually won our love. He would grab us Dunkin' in the morning. He was cleaning up his messes and our messes. And we're like, we really like this guy. So instead of my two, I ended up with three roommates.
Do you think that whole, well, actually, we should say one other thing. So you were at University of New Haven. University of New Haven is famous for its kind of criminal justice program there. And I guess some of the other RAs sort of interpreted their mission as sort of an on-ramp to their career in criminal justice and catching bad guys. Tell us about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think of myself, I definitely would find leadership roles. And so becoming an RA at this specific university, the University of New Haven, they had this very high expectation of the res life. As second you sign the contract to the second it's up, you are this role model on campus. And, I was there for communication, for theater. I was just there to have a good time for not a long time. And I really cared that the kids were having fun and that the kids were safe, the kids being residents. But there were definitely some folks on the staff who took their role so seriously to the point where they were sniffing under doors. This one kid was like, let me show you a trick. And he's like, you can really catch them if they're smoking the marijuana. If you sniff under the door and if you look in their window, you can see. And I was like, whoa. Like, I'm all for keeping people safe and I'm all for doing our job to the best of our ability. But when this man was on his hands and knees sniffing under the door, he kind of lost me. I'm not going to lie to you. And I do think that it had to do with the criminal justice sort of background, because when I went to go visit UConn one time, I was looking around for the RA. I'm like trying to check in and I was like, where's the RA? And I think they just run things differently. This was many years ago too, by the way. This could be very different now. But the person I was visiting was like, oh yeah, no, you don't really have to check in here. And they have an event like once in a while. And I was like, well, what's your RA's name? Do you know? Are you close? And he's like, no, like I have no clue. And I was like, wow. That's
the proverbial light touch.
Yes.
Well, for Jessica Fontenez, A Star Is Born, we'll have to have you back to talk about something else because you're great at this.
Oh, thank you.
CD Public's lead social media editor as of June 3rd. And thanks to everybody who helped out with this show, especially the maestro, and of course, McCusker, the Wonder Kid, and our bad cat, Penelope.
Satan was my roommate, so junior year was hell. He lacked social skills and had a pungent smell. When your roommate is the devil, it can be extremely whack. Putting posters on the wall of Trapped in Nickelback. Until the break of dawn, he'd be mutilating sheep. It's 4 a.m., Satan, can you please go to sleep? I can't have girls over when the dorm smells like sterno. When